to encourage the development of a distributed solar generation market in Sao Paulo. Before we begin, I'll quickly go over some of the webinar features. For audio, you have two options. You may either listen through your computer or over the telephone. If you choose to listen through your computer, please select the mic and speakers option in the audio pane. If you want to dial in by phone, please select the telephone option, and a box on the right side will display the telephone number and audio pin you should use to dial in. If you'd like to ask a question, we ask that you use the questions pane where you may type in your question. The audio recording and presentations will be posted in the Solution Center training page within a few days of the broadcast and will be added to the Solution Center YouTube channel, where you will find other informative webinars as well as video interviews with thought leaders on clean energy policy topics. Finally, one important note of mention before we begin our presentation is that the Clean Energy Solution Center does not endorse or recommend specific products or services. Information provided in this webinar is featured in the Solution Center's resource library as one of many best practice resources reviewed and selected by technical experts. Today's webinar agenda is centered around the presentation from our guest speaker, Rodrigo Garcia, who has joined us to discuss suitable policies and conditions to nurture a competitive market for photovoltaic distributed generation, PVDG, with an emphasis on the commercial, industrial, C&I market. Before we jump into the presentation, I will provide a quick overview of the Clean Energy Solution Center. Then, following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session where the speaker will address questions submitted by the audience. At the end of the webinar, you will be automatically prompted to fill out a brief survey as well. So thank you in advance for taking a moment to respond. The Solution Center was launched in 2011 under the Clean Energy Ministerial. The Clean Energy Ministerial is a high-level global forum to promote policies and programs that advance clean energy technology, to share lessons learned and best practices, and to encourage the transition to a global clean energy economy. 24 countries and the European Commission are members, contributing 90% of clean energy investments and responsible for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This webinar is provided by the Clean Energy Solution Center, which is an initiative of the Clean Energy Ministerial. The Solution Center focuses on helping government policymakers design and adopt policies and programs that support the deployment of clean energy technologies. This is accomplished through support in crafting and implementing policies related to energy access, no-cost expert policy assistance, and peer-to-peer learning and training tools, such as this webinar. The Clean Energy Solution Center is co-sponsored by the governments of Australia, Sweden, and the United States. The Solution Center provides several clean energy policy programs and services, including a team of over 60 global experts that can provide remote and in-person technical assistance to governments and government-supported institutions, no-cost virtual webinar trainings on a variety of clean energy topics, partnership building with developmental agencies and regional and global organizations to deliver support, an online library containing over 2,500 clean energy policy-related publications, tools, videos, and other resources. Our primary audience is made up of energy policymakers and analysts from governments and technical organizations in all countries, but we also strive to engage with the private sector, NGOs, and civil society. The Solution Center is an international initiative that works with more than 35 international partners across its suite of different programs. Several of the partners are listed above and include research organizations like IRENA and the IEA, programs like C4All, and regionally focused entities such as ECOWAS, Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. A marquee feature that the Solution Center provides is the no-cost expert policy assistance known as AskanExpert. The AskanExpert service matches policymakers with one of the more than 60 global experts selected as authoritative leaders on specific clean energy finance and policy topics. For example, in the area of solar energy, we are pleased to have Catherine Wright, Senior Associate at Cadmus, serving as one of our experts. If you have a need for policy assistance in solar energy or any other clean energy sector, we encourage you to use this valuable service. Again, the assistance is provided free of charge. If you have a question for our experts, please submit it through a simple online form at cleanenergysolutions.org/expert. We also invite you to spread the word about the service to those in your networks and organizations. Now I'd like to provide a brief introduction for today's speaker, Rodrigo Garcia, who is the founder and managing director of Implementasur. He is a renowned consultant with more than 16 years of experience in the area of energy and climate change. Among the clients that Rodrigo has been able to assist during this period are the German Society for International Cooperation, GIZ, the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. And with that introduction, I'd like to welcome Rodrigo to the webinar.
Many thanks. I'm going to share my screen now to go directly to the presentation that we have prepared for this. Can you see the deck, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
First, thanks to NREL and the Clean Energy Solutions Center for relying on Implementasur to assist the consortia of Western municipalities of the Sao Paulo state in Brazil, COESTE, in order to advise them on specific recommendations to foster the development of distributed generations, and particular solar distributed generation. This is the agenda of how we're going to approach this presentation. Very briefly, I'm going to give you an insight of what does Implementasur is assisting on, what are our types of services. Then I'm going to jump into an introduction of the type of advisory that we delivered to COESTE through the AskanExpert model of the Clean Energy Solutions Center. And then we're going to jump into the market context of distributed generation photovoltaics for COESTE, what has been going on in the last years. Then we're going to dive into the specific competitiveness metrics for the PVDG market and what are the financial challenges. Then some very broad revision of the case studies that we use to advise COESTE on how they can approach this challenge. And finally, some recommendations and a policy roadmap to encourage an accelerated deployment of PVDG. So first, about Implementasur, our most important motive is to turn climate change into not just a matter of risk, but also into a value creation opportunity, an opportunity where some organizations can address this transition and create value. We are assisting companies into first providing risk assessment, business models, and accessing financial instruments for the adaptation and mitigation actions that different partners and actors can require in Latin America. Today, we are exposed to physical risks from climate change, such as acute and chronic effects, but also transition risk from a low-carbon transition, from regulations or market competitions of low-carbon energy technologies, or reputation effects from the customer side or from investors. To address this type of risks, we have a three-step approach that is led by first an assessment of the climate-related risks that influence investment and projects. We help to formulate the business opportunity through business models and policy recommendations to open these market niches. And finally, we come together with our customers to enable the mobilization of financial resources through concessional funding. So this set of services helps the migration of resources that are exposed to a specific risk into new sustainable investments. From our experience, we can pitch briefly that we have been advising several multilateral international organizations, private market actors such as BHP, Google, among others, and different government organizations such as the Chilean Ministry of Transportation or the Chilean Forestry Service. We have been advising successfully into approving funds from the Green Climate Fund and government programs or bilateral cooperation with the government of the Netherlands and the government of Canada. Our team encompasses experts that are coming from financial institutions, multilateral institutions, and local government agencies, but also that have a long track record in consultancy within the area of climate change and sustainable energy. So now getting into the topic of today's webinar, this challenge, the need of COESTE, which is a consortia of 10 municipalities in the state of Sao Paulo, they have reached the Clean Energy Solutions Center through the free of charge AskanExpert model to assist them in the design or the recommendation of specific policies to encourage the deployment of PVDG. This is a picture actually of one of the first installations in that state, in the state of Sao Paulo. And the final objective is to come with a specific set of policies and options to nurture a market. This is a first approach for this customer that can help them start to frame a more clear scope of analysis. So the scope of work, the scope of the advisory that we provided to COESTE is structured in 3 levels. First, a diagnostic of the level of competitiveness that PVDG has in the municipalities of COESTE and at the state of Sao Paulo, with a specific focus in commercial and industrial customers. We provided an assessment of the financial gaps that are still not covered by the federal and state level programs, and the state of the local suppliers, which are a very important share of this equation and important share in the effort to foster PVDG. Second, we leveraged some of the lessons from 4 international cases to understand really what is the potential applicability into the COESTE context. And finally, we deliver a set of recommendations to construct a policy roadmap that could help COESTE implement a more aggressive program for fostering PVDG. So Brazil, it has an excellent solar horizontal radiation, as you can see from this map from NREL. It has a range among 1,500 and 2,300 kilowatt per square meter per year, which also has a very good fit with the country's load profile. And although it has a lot of very good basic natural conditions, the rate of adoption of PVDG has not been as fast as expected, and not necessarily is responded from the quality of the resource. So far, the most important policies, or the policies that have taken have been longer time available, are those that were meant to attend remote consumptions, remote users, like the PRODEM program or the Luz para Todos program, which are very constrained to small applications. But then in 2012, a very new regulation came into play with the possibility of allowing customers to discount part of their energy bills through a net metering resolution 482, and then later resolution 687 from 2015, which really set the basic regulatory framework for net metering. And I'm going to discuss that further in the later slides. So also, thanks to the rapid deployment in the cost of the technology, a lot of the expectations in the growth increased very rapidly. So the main government actor that makes the planning, the energy planning in Brazil, had to update their forecast very rapidly from one year to another. From an expectation that in 2014, they forecasted that in 2024 there's going to be an installation of a total PV-DG capacity of 1,300, but it then jumped to an expectation that in the same year there was going to be an installation of 2,500, and very likely this forecast it will need to be updated again. So in the Brazilian context, let's see what type of PV-DG categories are available. So first we have the microgeneration, which are all those very small applications below 75 kilowatts of capacity that are connected to the secondary distribution voltage. And then we have those that are on a higher level of capacity that can provide supply to higher loads, like mini generation, mini geração, which is in the range of above 75 kilowatts but below 5 megawatts, connected to the primary distribution voltage level. And in order to understand and to really structure this assessment, we followed a framework. We built up a conceptual framework that could have three main elements. First, the tax incentives that could facilitate the adoption of PV-DG. Second, the financial incentives, such as state or federal incentives, like loan guarantees. And then the assessment of all the regulatory and business conditions for self-supply solutions that could drive the demand for public institutions and private customers. So one of the things that we learned is that actually none of these elements frame the competitiveness of PV-DG by themselves. Instead, it is the proper balance within these three elements that will actually give place to a healthy adoption and growth of the PV-DG market. Indeed, a recent study from the Department of Economics of the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and the Climate Policy Initiative highlights the fact that demand-side factors like population, like income, and the electricity tariffs are definitely some of the most important factors driving the competitive deployment of PV-DG. So based on that, we started making an overview of what was the market context for this set of 10 municipalities and how they compared with the rest of the Sao Paulo state. So first, there is a very important database of information which has built by the country's electricity regulator, ANEEL, which has a very complete DG, distributed generation database. And thanks to this, we were able to compare the loads, the energy demand, how the energy demand evolved in time between 2014 and 2016. And we could see that there is a fall in the consumption between these years, a very low fall, but actually a fall. So it's shows that any type of PV-DG project will have to monitor very clearly what's the real load that is expected in the long run to make sure that these projects are bankable. Second, we found out that COESTE represents a very small share of the total Sao Paulo demand. Although COESTE is an important industrial region, but it's not necessarily covering the largest load because the city of Sao Paulo itself is not included in this set of municipalities. So this is not necessarily covering the largest level of the load. The annual growth rate for COESTE we also found that has been 5 times lower than the rest of the municipalities in the Sao Paulo state. There is actually a drop. For example, between 2015 and 2017, the annual growth rate of DG PV installations was 1,500 per year, like growing a lot. But in COESTE, this has been just 360, multiple of 3 for the installation of PV-DG, showing a little bit of signs of delay compared to other regions and other municipalities that have potential better conditions. So we came on to understand what was the reason behind that. Also, COESTE has shown a larger space for growth in the segment of microgeneration. We remember microgeneration being all those installations that have a capacity lower to 75 kilowatts, and this is responding to the fact that, as we can see in the chart, in the case of COESTE in blue, there is a much lower share from the total installations compared to the rest of Sao Paulo, where the micro capacity installations of PV-DG has a larger importance. So in COESTE, micro installations have around 50% of the total installation capacity and 50% for the mini generação, while in the rest of the Sao Paulo municipalities, the distribution is almost 90% for micro generação and 10.3% for mini generation. So this leaves a huge space for growth in that segment. What type of incentives are in place? There are some incentives that have a federal scope, federal reach. It's such as the ProGD program. It's the Programa de Desenvolvimiento de Generação Distribuida de Energía Eléctrica. This is a program that was launched in 2015, and it's a very broad framework to foster the deployment of distributed generation projects, specifically solar. And it has estimated that until 2030, thanks to this program, they will invest more than 30 billion new DG projects with the capacity to provide 48 million megawatt hour generated in that period, in the whole period from the implementation of the program until 2030. It's a very ambitious program, but it doesn't necessarily have like a very clear narrative to the local conditions of each municipality and each concessional zone for the distribution companies. There are also some tax incentives in place, taxes that apply to the energy retailing from these PV-DG units, like Convenio ECMS 6 from 2013 and ECMS 16 for 2015, which replaced the previous one. ECMS 16 has more taxing the net energy injected from PV-DG units into the grid, and Sao Paulo is adhered to this agreement. This is a discount on that tax, so allows a better competitive condition for PV-DG units. There's also a discount on the PIS/COFINS taxes, which are taxes that are applied from the government to maintain social programs. And there is also a discount on the EP, the tax for industrialized products that is applied to all national and imports products. Also there is important to mention that there are some financial institutions in the country at the federal and state level that have a specific low-cost loans that can help to accelerate the deployment of PVDG, such as those programs from BNDES, from the Caixa, from Agencia de Desenvolvimiento Paulista, from Desenvolve Sao Paulo. And some of these programs have specific conditions that part of the components of the beneficiaries of the projects from the beneficiaries have to have some level of local content. Most of the funding from this financial incentives have gone directly to large utility scale projects, and there's still some road ahead to promote further the development of PVDG. So I mentioned previously very briefly about the changes in the regulation for net metering, the changes that are built on the resolution 687, and these changes allow a better leverage for and a better upside for PVDG and its attractiveness that can help to improve its attractiveness beyond self-supply solution. So there is the value of the surplus generation that goes beyond the energy use that is discounted from the energy bill. Has a better market value now, since the new resolution allows to the option to use the surplus energy for up to 60 months. So you can actually transfer the surplus generated by a PVDG facility through 60 months in the future, instead of the 36 months that were the conditions of the previous regulation. Then also that has allows now a capacity of PVDG units for net metering that can reach up to 5,000 kilowatts. So that allows significant economies of scale, especially for the OPEX of the cost structure. This new resolution also allows to include other business models, such as where the consumer, for example, can use the credits, their surplus of energy from their unit, from their facility, to pay for the electricity bills on other properties, on other areas that they own. And the energy generated from different consumer units, from different users, can also be aggregated and discount the energy cost from different consumers. The Cámara de Comercializado de Energía Eléctrica, the CCEE, which is meant to participate in the regulatory process of the retail of electricity, has been studying recently the regulatory options to actually have this surplus generation access the retail market and not necessarily be able just to have a value from the distribution company. So what is the status of the market of suppliers, the supply side? As we can see on this map that represents all the different states in Brazil, the concentration of suppliers, it's very strongly correlated with the area of the COS, the municipalities. We can see that 48% of the suppliers, according to a study from Instituto Ideal, is located in the southeast area of Brazil, which is actually where the COS municipalities are. So the reason of why there has been a delay on the COS catch up on PVDG might not be the number of suppliers, but rather other type of reasons. So on this chart, we can see the different type of marketing options and commercial options that suppliers actually have in Brazil so far. And we can see that there's a large share of the type of models recognized by Instituto Ideal that are concentrated on turnkey contracts, in cash agreements, just installments, with or without bank debt. Very, very few models are relying on a PPA or a leasing or an ESCO model, which could have the benefit of sharing part of the risk with the off-taker and potentially distribute the capex through a tariff in time. So also something that we want to highlight is that the market of suppliers is generally represented by very, very small companies that don't have enough working capital, that are built of very few members, and therefore don't have the capacity to invest in the projects, or neither have a very aggressive market approach or go-to-market strategy. In addition to this, in terms of the capacity and the quality of this market of installers and suppliers, and based on data from Portal Solar for the Sao Paulo state, we can see that there are real financial barriers that prevent these installers and suppliers to actually use business models that are less intensive on capital, like a leasing model or an ESCO model. And a large part of these suppliers still does not have enough projects. Although this is not official information provided by the government or a third-party independent verifier, this is a good proxy to recognize the large share of suppliers that still do not have projects or that still do not have enough experience. So in terms of the theoretical competitiveness that the PVDG market can have compared to the distribution tariff, to the cost of electricity for users connected to the distribution network, we can see from the graph on the right-hand side that there is potentially grid parity for a very, very broad set of distribution companies all around the different areas of Brazil, which represents here more than 96% of the distributed market. And highlighted in red in these boxes, we can see those concessions companies, distribution companies, or concession zones that are representing the Oeste area. This shows the differences among the prices for electricity cost and tariffs, show the different type of exemptions that some companies can, some concession companies could have. Also the effect of the rates, for example, related with the drought in certain areas, or the cost for the expansion of the system, of the distribution network. And so that's why we have different tariff prices at different concession zones. And the different PVDG cost also respond to the different type of financial incentives that interplay at the federal, state, and municipal level. It is more likely, this shows that it's more likely to find that PVDG can reach a tipping point of competitiveness with the grid. Still, every project, every PVDG project has to be studied and analyzed on its own merit. And this is by no means, this graph is by no means a categorical statement of the competitiveness. However, it gives us a proxy of what is the current reality, and that there are several factors that can dynamically influence the economic feasibility of these projects, like the exchange rate, of course, which is definitely very influential in Brazil, the installation cost, and most important, the electricity tariff for the C&I consumers. Indeed, some references point out that the PV-DG investments in some areas of Sao Paulo state could confront a very long payback of more than 20 years. So it all depends on what type of assumptions are we using, or what type of conditions are we confronting. Indeed, the EPE, which is the planning agency for Brazil's energy market, states that only consumers with high purchasing power and an average consumption of 400 to 1,000 kilowatt per month will have potentially the proper conditions to become the adopters of PV-DG. There are some specific factors that restricts the development. Some customers could be exposed to distribution tariffs that are reduced because of local regulations, such as Law 12783, and some C&I customers, commercial and industrial customers, could be potentially tempted to migrate from a regulated tariff structure into the wholesale market, and therefore they might have better options for renewable energy supply in the long run. So in terms of financial challenges, given that we now understand what is the status of the market and what is the status of the gaps that the market have to deploy PV-DG, there are, for this type of very atomized units and small units of generation, there are high transactional costs, mainly because of the high due diligence cost that this type of that financing these investments could confront. There is limited acceptability from the banks of the collaterals that these C&I customers, such as MSME companies, could provide, especially relying on the value of the contract for the supply of energy and the savings that they can create thanks to a PV-DG project. Also, the average financial institution in emerging countries in general don't have the proper specialized knowledge on renewables. Therefore, they're gonna hardly believe that this type of contracts can be a good collateral or can be a good guarantee of the expected revenues. But if we're able to actually cut down the financial cost into 20%, the expectations from different local references is that this could reduce the cost of PV-DG projects by 6 or 10%. So what is there are potential market actors that can actually play that role of reducing the financial cost and cover part of that risk. These are market actors that can aggregate demand, that can identify all the potential customers in different levels and standardize their contracts, and that can translate the initial capital into a tariff or a lease through time. Therefore, through this type of model, the final customer just will have to pay a monthly fee and will be able to reduce the capital intensity of the investment, and it will also allow significant economies of scale, since one single transaction could cover several assets. Nevertheless, this market is not necessarily very simple to create, since developers of this type of aggregated investments still have to go through a capital and resource intensive origination process. They will have to standardize the assets to minimum requirements set from financial institutions, and some of these aggregators might still be small and medium enterprises that don't have enough initial capital to start this type of process or start attracting other sources of private capital. So what can we learn from what has been going on abroad, and what type of alternatives do we have that could complement the local regulation on net metering and this idea of having aggregators for the investments? First of all, one example, one particular case comes from the Property Assessed Clean Energy program that started in the US originally, which is called PACE. This is a mechanism that where beneficiaries of this type of programs voluntarily add an assessment to their property tax bill. So all equipments, PV, equipments, and the debt related to that are attached to the value of the property and not to the specific owner. So it can offer a repayment at a low interest rate, just like a mortgage. This would work out as very similar to a long-term loan, and it has been applied to energy efficiency and renewable energy facilities. So this not implies an upfront cost to the project property owner. It can have a potential or access to potential savings from the taxes in case the local regulation allows it to, and the Treasury would recover all the value and have that local housing tax include the extra cost for the PVDG facility. So this would be a way to easily transfer the additional cost into through the lifetime of the unit. So as we can see in the chart here, the energy savings that can be expected from this type of sustainable energy investments can represent an amount that is higher than the amortization, and that would be transferred as a surcharge on the real estate taxes. In this way, of course, this would require some normative changes to the municipal real estate taxes, and that is something that COST would have to confirm if they're capable of doing it. Alternatively, this can also operate through the banks, through a mortgage loan and modifying the mortgage loan for a house. Some of the benefits that the PACE program has accomplished in the United States. For example, in the United States, as this is our source coming from PACE Nation, it has covered already 33 states, around 80% of the total population of the United States, that it's included in these 33 states, and it's covered more than $5,500 million of installations at the residential level and the commercial level. So it has been a very successful program historically. The banks can use the property and to include the PVDG installation and use that as a valid collateral for their loan they're providing, just like it happens with a standard mortgage loan. And it generally would not require a credit check, just having the ownership of the property. This would leverage, in the standard type of PACE model, it would leverage the existing collection systems or tax collection systems that municipalities and counties have, and it will increase the value of the real estate properties, since you would be adding a new asset from the PVDG plant. Other case studies, specific case studies that applied the PACE model, the Sonoma County Energy Independence Program, which allowed the implementation of PACE through the capitalization from green bonds that were purchased by Sonoma County's treasury, through also receiving funding from the water agency and also from private actors. This program also implemented a marketplace to attract providers, to attract different financial options, and achieved a total of 11.3 megawatts of installed capacity, almost $54 million of investment since 10 years ago. The Boulder County Climate Smart Loan Program was the first PACE program implemented that also addressed energy efficiency opportunities and covered loans from range of $3,000 till a maximum of between the value of $50,000 and the 20% of the property value. This achieved a total of $9 million of investments, up to almost 230 projects, and it also was funded through the issuance of green bonds. The Connecticut Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program was connected with the Connecticut Green Bank to make the issuance of the green bonds and facilitate the capitalization of the program. This is focused on non-residential real estate assets, which is very close to what COSTE wants to do. And the achievements, and by early 2018, CPACE had reached up to 200 projects with a total investment of $114 million of investment. Finally, the other model that we covered in our study to COSTE is the India Solar Municipal Bonds model that has a very ambitious target from the Indian government to reach to a total installation of 40 gigawatts of solar PV projects by 2022. Very ambitious target, where municipalities are operating as aggregators of PV capacity and also as issuers of green bonds into the capital markets. So it follows a very similar models than the one or a very similar role that municipalities have than the one that described under the other PACE programs. When here municipalities can leverage the proximity to the customers, they can leverage the fact that they have in India healthier credit profile than most of their customers and stronger balance sheets, so they can give the financial institutions a better guarantee to access a cheaper source of financing to facilitate grid parity and the deployment of these type of facilities. So now we jump into what were the recommendations that we gave and the policy roadmap that we gave to COSTE based on all the different descriptions that we provided and the case studies. So first, to set a clear business plan for what is going to be the market niche. Here we're giving you an example of how this business plan be shaped. There's a specific market segment of C&I customers with high daily load for electricity consumption and good credit worthiness. This could be a good off-taker to facilitate the standardization and aggregation of investments at the C&I level. The value proposition will be the generation of savings, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions or local emissions, and increased value of the property, since the property would have now a new PVDG facility. Some of the demand parameters could be to choose the specific customers would be the income level, the credit rating, the load consumption, the potential of emission reductions, and if some of these customers have actually an internal price of carbon or have some condition from their market. some of the distribution channels in order to reach out the customers could be the municipalities themselves that could build up specific organizations to originate the pipeline. The revenue structures would come from the delivery of feasibility studies, or the payment for the assets, or payment for specific services through ESCO model, or even through a similar type of structure paid through the property tax, like we explained by the PACE model. Finally, the cost structure is going to be built up of 5 financial costs for the initial capital, dissemination, materials, etc. Some of the steps that can help to design a financial instruments that can reduce the risk of this type of program and aggregation of atomized assets needs to follow the next steps that we are numbering here. These steps comes from NREL's guidelines on designing financial incentives. First, frame the design of the financial instruments. What is the risk policy, the exit policy from this type of program that could be led by the municipalities of COESTE, for example. Then second, involve the private sector to confirm what will be the source of capital that could leverage the funding of this program. Third, establish the expected life of the instrument, how long it will last and when it's going to be adopted by the market. Fourth, establish the political feasibility to make sure that there's no institutionality risks in the implementation of that program. Fifth, identify the articulation, the concatenation of this instrument or this program with other existing instruments. In the case of Brazil, we talked about Project D. We talked about the normative conditions for net metering. We talked about the financial incentives from local financial agencies, and we would need to make sure that this program does not replicate any of those efforts. Six, consider resources for the marketing of the financial instruments and to build up the portfolio and go door to door, collecting and gathering this aggregation of PVDG opportunities, and track finally the performance of the instrument once it's implemented. Track the performance in terms of emission reductions, revenue stream, etc. This chart shows what are all the different dimensions to reach out the market, the areas of intervention from the capital provider and into the renewable energy opportunities, for example, or energy efficiency opportunities. And it's a very, very good simplification to actually identify that some of the most important financial mechanisms are going to be in the second level and in the risk management mechanisms, so that these can easily channel additional sources of capital from commercial banks or from the established government financial instruments. So preliminarily, in a context where there are already a lot of instruments in place and financial products in place, the recommended option will be to study in what way risk management instruments could facilitate the aggregation process and the origination process of a competitive pipeline of PVDG. Finally, to structure the policy and to build up all these inputs, we recommend COESTE to follow these steps. Make sure there is a political, legislative, and institutional coordination. Make sure that they can build up a standard of suppliers to ensure the quality and the solvency of the investments contractually. Third, confirm that municipalities don't have obstacles to act as financial entities and that can promote the generation of energy. And also here we we're including the fact that it's important to study the capacity of the property taxes of those municipalities to include the additional cost of PVDG facilities so as to facilitate the implementation of a PACE program. Finally, fourth level, make the financial assessment and the assessment of the flexibilities and institutional structures to receive the funding, for example, from multilaterals or from the Green Climate Fund or impact investors, to actually capitalize the operation of this program. On the fifth level, set the financial terms and conditions for those that are going to be benefited, such as some of the CNI companies or PVDG installers that will be potentially delivering part of the capital of these projects. So these beneficiaries will be following a set of terms and conditions, including the MRV system, a monitoring, reporting, and verification system, and potentially a framework for environmental and social safeguards. Therefore, set a strategy for their capitalization. Once we have defined the specific financial instrument, we can go and attract donors and potential other funding international organizations to join the program. Seventh, come up with the actual pipeline origination. This could be motivated through energy audits, for example, by reading exactly what is going to be the load profile of the niche market that we will focus on, and identify the capital requirements of installers and aggregators. And finally, implement the PVDG program through building up the origination of the project, then financing the structure of those projects that have been collected, and then collecting the payments for this. These are my contact details. Happy to share more of the insights of this brief advisory that we did to COESTE. I'm happy to receive now questions during the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for that outstanding presentation. As we shift to the Q&A, I'd like to remind our attendees to please submit questions through the question pane. I actually see one already, and I will pass that to you now. Why the impact of energy storage in fostering PVDG is not considered in this study?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So initially, this was requested a good set of months ago. COESTE didn't have that in mind yet, and there weren't a lot of examples on battery solutions or storage solutions as the distributed energy resources level that could give us a hint of how competitive that type of combination could be. So we prefer to focus on the assessment of the PVDG niche, although this type of business models and financial mechanisms could be applied to encompass a PV plus storage solution.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Okay, I have one more here, and then we'll wrap up after that. Let's see. Could you give an example as to understand when it's convenient to use one financial instrument over another to boost these types of projects?
Sure. So generally, for example, the standard debt instruments from commercial banks will have a larger interest rate, and they will be suitable for investments that don't have much risk, that are already, for example, already built, are in operation, or have more predictable revenue streams. whereas very risky endeavors where you are aggregating different assets, that you are starting a pilot initiative, you will require potential funding from actors that are aiming to get higher level of margins, higher returns, and are also more likely to take higher risks, like capital providers or private equity firms, etc. So that would be in terms of the type of source of funding, of source of capital provider, and the type of the specific risk management mechanisms. It really all depends on the status of maturity of the specific intervention. If actually just requires, for example, a loan guarantee to cover the risk of the construction, or if there is really the need of covering another type of risk, a commercial risk, where the loan guarantee might need to be escalated.
Thank you again for that informative Q&A session. For any questions that we didn't get time for, we'll connect to those attendees offline after the webinar. On behalf of the Clean Energy Solutions Center, I'd like to extend a thank you to Rodrigo and to our attendees for participating in today's webinar. We very much appreciate your time and hope in return that there were some valuable insights that you can take back to your ministries, departments, or organizations. We also invite you to inform your colleagues and those in your networks about Solution Center resources and services, including no-cost policy support through our AskanExpert service. I invite you to check the Solution Center website if you would like to view the slides and listen to a recording of today's presentations, as well as previously held webinars. Additionally, you will find information on upcoming webinars and other training events. We are also now posting webinar recordings to the Clean Energy Solutions Center YouTube channel. Please allow for about 1 week for the audio recording to be posted. Finally, I would like to kindly ask you to take a moment to complete the short survey that will appear when we conclude the webinar. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you again at future Clean Energy Solutions Center events. This concludes our webinar.